Emo and prog rock, these are two genres of music that really shouldn't work together. However, thanks to Coheed and Cambria, they do. Hi people and Element Chili Con Carnage crew, it's Chili here, the man with iron in my eyes, and I'm doing a 5-minute review of Vaxis Act 3, the father of Make Believe by Coheed and Cambria. I guess over the past 2 decades, the band really has somewhat transitioned from their emo title, but Coheed and Cambria never strayed far from their prog rock roots while still pumping out epic tunes. Perhaps a few albums were a bit, hit and miss compared to the others, but I'd say that their last effort, Vaxis 2, A Window to the Waking Mind, was pretty solid effort. Well, that was nearly 3 years ago, and since then, I managed to catch Coheed and Cambria live for the first time a few months ago for their 20th anniversary of Good Apollo I'm Burning Star for Volume 1, From Fear Through the Eyes of God. Wow, nailed that in one take. Now this really rekindled my love for the band, so when the news broke that a new single, Searching for Tomorrow, was out and doing the rounds, I of course had to listen to it, and I became hooked. There was Claudio's epic vocals on full display with a solid poppy kind of under vibe throughout the tune here, with some awesome little guitar bits spread throughout the piece, and a great build up with its heavy distorted section of course, and an amazing but short guitar solo towards the end. I could look past that constant keyboard loop that underlines this piece for nearly its entire duration and feels rather unnecessary, because other than that there was so much going on in this tune to focus my attention on that it really just pulled away this minor flaw. Blindside Sunny is another single from the album that is an absolute banger and has Claudio again shouting like old times right out of the gate while being reinforced by this incredibly solid and great sounding drum work. It's a fast paced short affair that goes straight for the jugular and doesn't really miss. I should point out that the drums on here sound beefy and are perfect for this album. It's just great production levels to be expected of course with this band working with Zach Savini again, who has helped produce other albums for bands such as Blink-182, Limp Bizkit, 311 and Bring Me the Horizon, and of course their previous album. Someone Who Can was the last single released off this record before the album was dropped, and is the only one I'm kind of sitting on the fence about. While the other 2 singles got me absolutely throbbing at the idea of this new album, this tune left me scratching my head. I mean, it's not horrendous, but it does feel, a bit out of place I guess. Because if you were just listening to these 3 songs in a row, this song just sounds very out of place. It reminds me a lot of generic 80s pop rock, and I'm sure that it's an ode to that style. I mean, if you told me that this entire song was lifted from a tune used in the Breakfast Club movie and re-recorded using modern sounding equipment but in the style of Coheed and Cambria, I'd believe you. What makes this song unusual is its perplexity to address the real-world scenario of growing old and irrelevant in a newer, more modern setting, instead of relying on his graphic novel as the narrative for the songwriting on hand. Claudio has instead become self-aware of his surroundings, in that he is no longer a young man in a young man's game, and maybe the band's best days are perhaps behind them with lyrics such as "Matters of the heart broken to bits, the end hits with insecurities that have been living with these right or wrong, terrified to tear apart this song." This is a very interesting line, and it really pains me to do what he says I guess, but I feel it's also the most honest we've ever heard Claudio on a record, as he lets us peek behind that curtain on this occasion, which does make sense if we're perhaps going for that nostalgic feel in this era kind of sound, and it's rather admirable to an extent.
The familiar feels so far in as I
Now let's expand a bit on this point here, because I wrote this note before the album was released. For most of their catalogue, the recordings have been centered around this stories from the Armory Wars, a graphic novel of course created by Claudio that is ongoing, and this album is once again no different. After all, it is part of 3 of 5 albums that are in the series. However, this record reflects upon Claudio's personal mindset more so than previous efforts, and feels rather grounded in reality, at times almost to a flaw. The message throughout this album is that time waits for no one, and no, it won't get any easier when I'm getting old. Keeping in mind that this band has been doing the rounds for nearly 3 decades, I know, where has time gone? You begin to get a sense of yearning for one's youth with a tinge of the great equalizer looming round the corner. Accepting the realities of growing old and the consequences it brings is a harsh reality lesson, and it makes for some dark moments throughout this album, but you could forgive the band's message as musically they still sound as vibrant as ever. They certainly smash out some high energy tunes on here on certain pieces. Now, speaking of high energy tunes, Play the Poet is a fantastic song that I want to give a shout out to. This track is the following piece after Blindside Sunny and perfectly transitions from that song to feel like a two-part piece. This is easily one of my favourite tracks off the album. Now, there are certainly some issues with the album that I would like to point out, and it has to relate to the beginning of this record. Coheed and Cambria are no strangers to slowly building up their music to the precipice by including an intro piece followed by a slow section track that builds into their grand opening tune. However, that seems to be missing here, and the beginning of this album feels like a slog to get through. Goodbye Sunshine is a solid tune, but doesn't really have that same effect as past efforts have had. I mean, how can you defend this first 10 minutes of the album knowing that Always and Never and Welcome Home exist? I guess we're always chasing the light when talking about previous efforts. Also, the closing track on this record just feels so out of place. So I also have to say, this album's artwork looks like it takes inspiration from 11 from Stranger Things if they slapped the black hole gravity over the top and rotated it 90 degrees on an angle. It almost looks like it was created by AI, if I'm being honest, with its smooth edges and design. Whether or not that's a gripe to you is entirely your opinion, but considering their past albums' artwork, well, they've been rather minimalistic in approach, then I gotta say at least the colouring makes it pop out on this album more so than the previous. Now, I think this album certainly has some tracks that are bangers, but it does contain some very slow pacing in certain sections of the record. With a runtime that's only 57 minutes, it doesn't feel like it's an over-bloated record. It does its part and certainly requires a few listens to become fully engrossed to, and that is perhaps one of the biggest issues this album faces. It just doesn't grab you on its first attention, except for maybe one or two tracks here or there. Overall, I'm going to give this album a score of 8 million chilies on the spicy scale, with my favourite tracks being Blindside Sunny, Play the Poet, and Mary of Mercy. Once again, I just want to reiterate that this is the third out of 5 albums that's going to be in this series by Coheed and Cambria, and that's fairly common when it comes to the band, given of course their history and the source material they have based their songwriting on. So we are going to expect 2 more albums from the Vaxis series to be released in the following year. So far it's been a fairly solid series. I've enjoyed what has been released, the first album which was just too long, let's be honest, but I have enjoyed these last 2 albums, and I've got to say I'm looking forward to the next installment whenever that comes out. If you've enjoyed this content, make sure to smash that like button, subscribe to us, and stay notified for future music related content, because it keeps our manager happy at the end of the day. We are also on Discord, Instagram, Facebook, and all those other social platforms if you want to check us out. As always, people, you have a great day and stay spicy.